Most people believe anger is something that happens to them. An insult is spoken, a tone shifts, a look carries contempt, and suddenly the body reacts. The pulse rises, the chest tightens, words rush forward before thought has time to intervene. They call this emotion. But in reality, it is something far more primitive. It is Dar's control. Not control over others, but control is over you. The moment someone can provoke anger inside you, they have discovered the most efficient lever that exists in human psychology. A lever that requires no force, no authority, no intelligence, only a small stimulus, and you respond automatically. Observe this carefully. When someone irritates you, when a comment lingers in your mind for hours, when disrespect burns quietly beneath your skin, you believe the other person has disturbed your peace, but the truth is colder. They have simply revealed a door that was already unlocked. Anger is not created by the outside world. It is activated. Most people spend their entire lives protecting their pride, defending their opinions, reacting to perceived slights. They believe they are preserving dignity. In reality, they are advertising their as psychological vulnerabilities. Every reaction is information. Every visible irritation is a signal that says, "Here is where I can be manipulated." Say, a calm strategist understands something the emotional mind cannot tolerate. Power does not come from expression. Power comes from immunity. Imagine two men standing in a crowded room. One reacts to every challenge. His face shifts with every comment. His tone rises when questioned. His posture tightens when criticized. The other remains still. Words reach him, but nothing moves beneath the surface. No visible tension. No urgency to respond. No hunger to correct the perceptions of others. One of these men is predictable. The other is dangerous. Because emotional predictability is the foundation of manipulation. The moment someone knows what angers you, they know as how to control your focus. And focus is the most valuable currency in psychological warfare. A single insult can occupy your thoughts for hours. A moment of disrespect can distort your entire day. But consider the absurdity of this. Another human being, with their own fears, insecurities, and hidden chaos, can simply release a few careless words. Oh, and suddenly they own your mind. Your mood shifts, your energy drains, your thoughts revolve around them. Without realizing it, you have surrendered the most intimate territory that exists, your internal state. This is why the strongest individuals throughout history shared a common trait that confused their enemies. They were not easily disturbed, not because they lacked emotion, but because they understood something fundamental about the psychology of power. Reaction is submission. When anger appears instantly, it means someone else has successfully dictated your internal chemistry. They pressed a button, and the system obeyed. Most people never question this system. They defend it. They justify their anger as righteousness, as passion, as strength. But uncontrolled anger is not strength, it is access. Access to your nervous system, access to your attention, access to your decisions. And the world is filled with individuals who instinctively test these access points, sometimes deliberately, often unconsciously. A subtle insult, a dismissive tone, a public challenge. Each one is a probe, a small psychological experiment to discover where your emotional structure fractures. Once that fracture is visible, control becomes effortless. This is why those who truly understand human nature begin with a radical realization. Peace is not kindness. Peace is as defenses. Emotional neutrality is not passivity. It is dross psychological armor. The moment you become difficult to provoke, something unusual happens. The people around you lose their leverage. Their words land, but they cannot penetrate. Their provocations dissolve into silence. And suddenly the dynamic shifts. Because the individual who cannot be emotionally steered becomes impossible to dominate. But achieving this state requires dismantling several hidden illusions about ego, respect, and identity. Illusions that most people protect without even realizing it. And the first illusion is the most dangerous one of all. The belief that anger is a natural response to disrespect. In reality, it is something far more revealing. Something that exposes exactly where your ego still demands validation. And once that mechanism is understood, a very different form of control becomes possible. But to reach that point, you must first confront the most fragile structure inside the human mind. the structure that quietly demands recognition, defense, and constant protection. The ego. The ego operates like an invisible contract with the world. It whispers a simple demand as, recognize me correctly, dos, respect me, agree with me, acknowledge my value, confirm the identity I believe I possess. Most people walk through life carrying this contract everywhere they go. They never announce it. They rarely notice it, yet they expect others to obey it automatically. When someone questions their competence, the contract is violated. When someone dismisses their opinion, the contract fractures. When someone shows indifference to their status, the mind interprets it as disrespect, and the reaction appears instantly. Anger. But anger is not the real emotion. It is merely the diva's defensive reflex that protects the ego when the contract is broken. Observe how fragile this system truly is. A stranger's opinion can alter someone's mood for an entire day. A careless remark can echo in the mind for hours. A moment of perceived disrespect can trigger a desire for retaliation, all because the ego believed the world had signed an agreement it never actually accepted. No one agreed to validate your identity. No one promised to respect your self-image. Yet the ego behaves as though such promises exist. This is why anger feels so personal. It is not simply a reaction to words. It is the mind attempting to restore a violated hierarchy. When someone challenges you, the ego immediately tries to correct the imbalance. It demands a response, a defense, a demonstration of strength. But the moment you react, something subtle happens. You have already accepted the premise of the challenge. You have acknowledged that their perception of you matters. And this is where psychological control quietly begins. Because the most powerful manipulation does not involve force. It involves attention. If someone can force you to defend your identity, they have successfully redirected your mental energy toward them. Your thoughts begin orbiting their words. Your internal dialogue becomes a courtroom where their accusations are constantly being argued against. Even if you never speak to them again, they remain inside your mind, occupying space they did not earn. This is the true cost of anger, not the raised voice, not the visible irritation. The cost is Tez's mental occupation. The strategist understands something that most emotional minds cannot accept. The ego's contract is voluntary. You can cancel it. You can walk through the world without expecting strangers, colleagues, or rivals to correctly recognize your worth. And the moment that expectation disappears, something extraordinary happens. Provocation loses its power. An insult becomes noise. A challenge becomes irrelevant. A dismissive attitude becomes invisible. Because the trigger has been removed. The ego no longer demands validation and therefore no longer requires defense. But this creates a strange side effect that unsettles many people. When you stop reacting, others begin to feel uncomfortable. Provocation is a social tool. People use it to measure boundaries, test status, and establish dominance within invisible hierarchies. They expect signals in return: irritation, correction, confrontation. When those signals never appear, the psychological script collapses. They cannot locate your pressure points, and humans become deeply uneasy around individuals whose emotional triggers remain hidden. Silence begins to replace conflict, and silence carries a different kind of authority. Yet this detachment requires confronting a deeper truth about human interaction. Most provocations are not about you at all. They are reflections of something unstable within the other person. A quiet insecurity, a need to elevate themselves by lowering someone else, a restless ego searching for confirmation of its own importance. But recognizing this intellectually is not enough. Because even when you understand the mechanism, the emotional impulse to react can still appear. A comment still lands, a tone still carries hostility, the nervous system still prepares for confrontation, which raises a more dangerous question. If anger is not caused by the outside world, then why does the mind still react so quickly? Why does the body move toward irritation before logic has time to intervene? The answer lies deeper than ego. It lies within a primitive system of perception that constantly scans the world for threats. A system that quietly interprets a disrespect as danger. And until that system is understood, complete emotional immunity remains impossible. Because the real trigger is not the insult. It is the mind's ancient fear of losing position within the hierarchy. Long before modern society invented manners, reputation, or social status, the human brain evolved inside harsh hierarchies. In primitive groups, position meant survival. Higher status meant better protection, better access to resources, and fewer threats. Lower status meant exposure, vulnerability, and constant pressure from those above. The brain never forgot this structure. Even now, thousands of years later, the nervous system quietly scans every interaction for signals of dominance and submission. A tone of voice, a dismissive gesture, a sarcastic remark in front of others. These small signals are not processed as harmless words. Deep in the brain, they are interpreted as shifts in hierarchy, and hierarchy determines safety. This is why disrespect feels so sharp, not because the words themselves are powerful, but because the brain interprets them as a threat to position. The moment someone undermines you, the mind instinctively prepares to correct the imbalance. It generates energy. Adrenaline rises, focus narrows, anger appears. But anger is not the enemy. It is the DOS primitive tool the brain uses to restore status. It demands action. Raise your voice, correct them, challenge them, reassert your position. The body believes this is necessary for survival, yet in modern life, reacting this way often achieves the opposite effect. Instead of restoring power, it exposes vulnerability. Because emotional reactions reveal something critical to observers. They reveal that your internal stability depends on external recognition. If someone can provoke you publicly, they have demonstrated that your emotional balance can be altered from the outside. And in social hierarchies, this information spreads quickly. Calm individuals are perceived as stable. Reactive individuals are perceived as easily moved. And those who can be moved can be influenced. This is why experienced strategists rarely react when challenged. They understand that the real battle is not happening in the conversation itself. The real battle is occurring in the perception of control. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, someone insults you and you respond immediately with anger. Your voice sharpens. Your posture tightens, the room feels tension. In the second, the insult lands and nothing changes. No visible reaction, no defensive explanation, no emotional shift, just stillness. The room becomes uncertain. The person who attempted the provocation suddenly faces a strange psychological mirror. Instead of gaining control over the interaction, they encounter resistance they cannot measure, because silence removes the feedback loop. Without reaction, they cannot determine whether they succeeded. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with this ambiguity. They expect emotional confirmation. When it does not appear, the power dynamic begins to reverse. The one who remains calm now controls the rhythm of the interaction. But achieving this level of control requires dismantling a powerful illusion the brain constantly generates. The illusion that every challenge requires a response. Most people believe silence signals weakness. In reality, silence often signals something far more unsettling: indifference. And indifference is one of the most destabilizing forces in human psychology. When someone insults you and receives anger, they feel acknowledged. When someone insults you and receives a defense, they feel validated. But when someone insults you and receives nothing, they are forced to confront something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that their attempt to influence you failed completely. This is where emotional immunity begins to form. Not through suppression of anger, but through a deeper shift in perception. You begin to see provocations for what they truly are: small tests, unconscious probes, attempts to gain psychological leverage. And once you recognize the pattern, something unusual happens. You stop treating these moments as personal attacks. You begin seeing them as diagnostic tools. Every insult reveals something about the person who delivered it: their insecurity, their need for validation, their attempt to establish dominance. But more importantly, it reveals whether you still carry hidden triggers inside your own mind, triggers that others can access. And as long as those triggers exist, complete emotional freedom remains an illusion, because somewhere beneath the surface, the mind is still waiting for the next challenge, the next slight, the next moment where it must decide whether to react or remain completely untouchable. There is a moment in every confrontation where control becomes visible. It is not the moment when voices rise. It is the moment when as one person reacts and the other does not. Human interaction runs on emotional exchange. Every signal expects a return signal. Anger invites anger. Defensiveness invites attack. Pride invites challenge. This exchange forms an invisible rhythm. Most people participate in it automatically. Someone raises their voice, they raise theirs higher. Someone insults them, they return a sharper insult. Someone challenges their authority, they rush to defend it. The pattern becomes predictable, and predictability is the birthplace of manipulation. But when emotional exchange suddenly stops, something unusual happens to the psychological structure of the interaction. The rhythm collapses. The other person releases an emotional signal and nothing comes back. No anger, no defense, no visible irritation, just stillness. This absence creates a strange tension in the human mind, because the brain depends on feedback to measure influence. Without reaction, it cannot determine whether its actions had any effect. Imagine throwing a stone into water. You expect ripples. If the surface remains perfectly still, something feels wrong. The mind begins searching for explanation. Did the stone miss? Was it absorbed? Did it matter at all? This is exactly what happens when someone attempts to provoke a person who refuses to react. The expected ripple never appears, and the individual who initiated the confrontation begins experiencing something far more uncomfortable than anger: uncertainty. Uncertainty destabilizes ego. When people cannot measure their effect on you, they begin questioning their own position in the hierarchy. Their confidence weakens. Their aggression becomes hesitant. Because aggression relies on visible impact, the calm individual has quietly removed that impact. This is the hidden strength of an emotional absencer. It is not passivity. It is strategic invisibility. You allow the other person to expose their intentions while you reveal nothing in return. They show irritation. You remain neutral. They attempt to provoke status competition. You refuse to enter the arena. They escalate emotional pressure. You provide no surface for that pressure to attach itself to. Over time, something fascinating occurs. Their emotional energy begins to collapse under its own weight. Without resistance, aggression loses direction. Without reaction, provocation loses meaning. Most confrontations do not end with victory or defeat. They simply lose momentum, and the person who refused to react remains untouched. However, reaching this level of control requires understanding a dangerous psychological trap. Many people attempt to suppress anger. They force themselves to remain silent while internally boiling with resentment. Their face appears calm, but inside the mind continues replaying the conflict again and again. This is not mastery, it is delayed reaction. The anger simply moves inward and begins consuming mental energy over time. True emotional absence is different. It occurs when the mind genuinely recognizes that the provocation does not deserve attention. No suppression is required, because the brain no longer interprets the stimulus as meaningful, the same way an adult does not feel insulted by a child's tantrum. The hierarchy is too obvious. The challenge carries no real weight. This shift in perception creates an unexpected psychological advantage. When people sense that they cannot disturb your emotional state, their strategies begin to fail. They cannot bait you into arguments. They cannot redirect your attention through insults. They cannot manipulate your reactions to gain control of the conversation. And eventually, they begin searching for someone else whose emotions remain accessible, someone easier to influence, someone who still believes every challenge must be answered. But there is one final layer to this discipline that most people never discover. Because remaining calm in a single moment is relatively simple. The real challenge appears later, when the interaction ends and the mind begins replaying everything that was said. Because even if you remained silent externally, the internal dialogue may still be active. And as long as that dialogue continues, the other person still occupies territory inside your mind. Which means they have not truly lost their influence. They have simply moved it somewhere less visible. The final stage of emotional control requires eliminating that hidden occupation completely. Not just silence in behavior, but silence in thought. Most confrontations do not end when the conversation stops. They continue inside the mind. Hours later, sometimes days later, the memory returns. A sentence replays. A sharper response appears too late. The mind reconstructs the entire scene again and again. What should have been a brief interaction quietly becomes a prolonged internal conflict. This is where many people misunderstand emotional control. They believe the victory lies in remaining calm during the moment of provocation. But the real battle begins just afterward, because the human mind is deeply uncomfortable with unfinished confrontations. It searches for resolution. When someone insults you, the brain immediately generates a psychological objective: restore balance, correct the hierarchy, repair the perceived damage to identity. If the confrontation ends without that restoration, the brain keeps working. It analyzes the conversation repeatedly, searching for the perfect response that never arrived. You imagine what you should have said. You replay their tone. You construct arguments that no longer matter. And without realizing it, you have granted the other person something incredibly valuable. Extended control over your attention dies. They are no longer present. Yet your thoughts continue orbiting them. Your mind becomes a courtroom where the trial never concludes. This phenomenon is not weakness. It is a survival mechanism. For most of human history, unresolved social conflict inside small communities could lead to exclusion, humiliation, or loss of protection. The brain evolved to obsess over these moments in order to prevent future threats. But in modern environments, this mechanism often becomes unnecessary suffering. The confrontation is already over. The person who provoked you has likely forgotten the entire exchange. Yet your mind continues revisiting it as though the conflict still exists. This is how psychological occupation works, not through physical presence. Through Ram's unfinished narratives. The strategist understands a brutal truth about these narratives. Closure is rarely achieved through confrontation. It is achieved through our irrelevance. The moment you recognize that the event carries no long-term consequence, the mind stops investing energy in it. But ego resists this conclusion. Ego insists the moment mattered. It insists your status was challenged. It insists the other person must be corrected or defeated. And so the mind continues replaying the scene, hoping to restore an imaginary balance. This is where true emotional sovereignty begins. You begin asking a very different question. Not, how should I have responded? But, why does this deserve space in my mind at all? The question alone begins dissolving the obsession. Because most provocations are insignificant the moment they end. They do not alter your future. They do not change your abilities. They do not determine your value. They are simply brief collisions between two nervous systems, each carrying their own insecurities, fears, and unconscious attempts at dominance. Once the interaction is finished, the only reason it continues is because your mind keeps feeding it attention. And attention is fuel. Without it, the memory loses intensity. The emotional charge fades. The event becomes ordinary background noise in the vast landscape of experience. But attention can only be withdrawn when you accept something that the ego hates. You do not need to win every psychological exchange. You do not need to correct every insult. You do not need to prove your position in every room. Because individuals who truly possess internal stability do not constantly defend their identity. They simply move forward. The mind becomes occupied with larger objectives, larger strategies, larger ambitions. And when your attention is directed towards something meaningful, the small provocations of ordinary people begin to look exactly like what they are: noise. But reaching this state requires one final transformation. A transformation that shifts your entire relationship with respect, status, and human perception. Because the individuals who are impossible to provoke share one quiet characteristic. They are no longer trying to control how others see them. And once that need disappears, something strange happens to anger. It begins to vanish entirely. Anger survives on a single psychological dependency: the need to be seen correctly. Most people never admit this need openly. They describe it with softer words: fairness, dignity, respect. But beneath those words lies something more fragile: the desire for others to confirm the identity we believe we possess. Competent, intelligent, capable, strong. When someone challenges that identity, the mind reacts instantly. Not because the words are dangerous, but because they threaten the image we carefully maintain. The ego feels exposed. And exposure creates urgency. The urge to correct, the urge to defend, the urge to restore the image that was disturbed. This is why anger appears so quickly in moments of disrespect. It is the ego rushing to repair its reflection in the eyes of others. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people never examine. Other people's perceptions are unstable. They are shaped by their mood, their insecurities, their biases, their limited understanding of you. The same person who admires you today may doubt you tomorrow. The same person who criticizes you today may respect you later. Human perception shifts constantly. Trying to control it is like trying to control the wind. Yet the ego dedicates enormous energy to this impossible task. Every argument becomes an attempt to fix someone's perception. Every defense becomes a campaign to restore status. Every reaction becomes proof that the external image still matters. And this is where emotional vulnerability hides. Because as long as your internal balance depends on how others see you, your emotional state remains das externally owned. A stranger can change it. A colleague can disturb it. A rival can manipulate it. All they must do is attack the image you are trying to protect. The strategist eventually reaches a different conclusion. Perception is not territory worth defending. It is fog, temporary, unstable, meaningless beyond the moment it appears. Once this realization settles deeply into the mind, something dramatic happens to anger. The emotional trigger disappears. If someone insults you, they are not attacking your identity. They are simply expressing their interpretation of a fragment they barely understand. Their perception does not define you. Their words do not restructure your abilities. Their opinions do not alter your trajectory. So the nervous system stops preparing for defense. The brain stops interpreting disrespect as a threat to survival. And the emotional storm never forms. Instead, you observe. You observe how quickly people reveal themselves when they attempt to provoke reactions. You observe how insecurity disguises itself as confidence. You observe how often aggression is merely a mask for internal instability. And because you are no longer participating emotionally, you gain something rare: clarity. Most individuals lose clarity during conflict because anger narrows their perception. It forces them to focus on defending themselves rather than understanding the dynamics of the interaction. But the person who remains calm sees everything: tone, motives, subtle attempts at dominance, hidden insecurities behind aggressive behavior. They gather information while others lose control. This creates a quiet but powerful reversal. The person attempting to provoke you believes they are influencing the situation. In reality, they are revealing themselves completely while you remain unreadable, and unreadable individuals hold a strange psychological advantage. People cannot easily manipulate what they cannot predict. But there is still one final truth that transforms this discipline from a technique into a permanent state of psychological power. Because eliminating anger is not ultimately about controlling emotions. It is about removing the internal structure that makes provocation possible. A structure built from ego, identity, and the constant need for validation. Once that structure dissolves, the entire game changes. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because the world loses its ability to disturb you at all. In the end, the ability to remain unbothered is not a trick. It is a transformation. Most people spend their lives defending an invisible structure built inside their minds, a fragile architecture made of reputation, pride, validation, and identity. They guard it constantly. Every criticism feels like damage. Every insult feels like a crack in the walls. So they react, they argue, they explain, they attempt to repair the image others hold of them. And through this endless defense, they unknowingly surrender control of their internal world. Because anyone who can provoke your defense can redirect your energy. Anyone who can disturb your emotions can dictate your focus. But the individual who becomes impossible to provoke has stepped outside this structure entirely. They no longer depend on the fragile mirror of other people's opinions. They understand a deeper principle of psychological power. Your internal state is the only territory that truly belongs to you. And once you stop allowing strangers to enter that territory, something profound happens. Conflict begins to lose its gravity. Words that once felt sharp become dull. Insults that once demanded reaction begin to sound distant. Challenges that once triggered anger now appear small, almost predictable, because you finally see the pattern clearly. Most provocations are not acts of strength. They are signals of instability. They come from individuals who need reactions to confirm their own importance. They test boundaries not because they are powerful, but because they are uncertain of their position. They search for friction, and friction requires participation. Without participation, their attempts collapse into silence. This is why the calm individual appears so unsettling. They remove the emotional stage that others unconsciously expect. There is no performance, no visible irritation, no urgency to prove anything, just stillness. And stillness has a strange psychological effect on those around you. People begin to measure their own behavior more carefully. Aggression softens. Provocations fade. Conversations shift, not because you demanded respect, but because emotional control quietly communicates something far more powerful than dominance. It communicates Zeppe's self-sufficiencies. You do not need approval. You do not require validation. You do not react to every challenge like someone defending fragile territory. And this absence of need changes the hierarchy of every interaction you enter. The one who needs nothing becomes difficult to influence, difficult to manipulate, difficult to disturb. But the deepest shift happens internally. When anger disappears, an enormous amount of mental energy returns to you, energy that was once spent replaying conversations, defending identity, imagining retaliation. All of it becomes available again, and with that energy comes clarity. You begin noticing how much of the world's conflict is unnecessary noise. How many arguments lead nowhere, how many emotional battles are fought over illusions of status and recognition. Most people remain trapped inside those battles for their entire lives, reacting, defending, proving. But the individual who has learned to remain untouched walks through those same environments differently. They observe more than they react. They choose where their attention goes. They move forward while others remain stuck in emotional collisions that repeat endlessly. And in that quiet separation lies the final truth behind never being angered or bothered by anyone. It is not about suppressing emotion. It is about reaching a point where the provocations of ordinary minds simply no longer matters. Because once your identity is no longer dependent on external recognition, no insult can reduce you, no disrespect can define you, and no person holds the power to disturb the calm authority that exists within someone who has stopped playing the emotional games of the world.